if we lost, say, 10% of our capability due to a disruption, that means I wouldn't have a total loss. I would only have 10% of the asset value as a loss every time it happens. So, for example, if somebody shoplifts something from our store, when they shoplift, did they shoplift everything or just a piece of what we own? But every time someone shoplifts, it adds up, right? So, in order to determine what our overall losses are for a year, how are we going to compute this? Well, on a per incident basis, we'll compute it first. And once we know a per incident basis, every time somebody shoplifts, it costs us this much money. Every time we have to shut our doors to new customers, it costs us that much money. We figure out a per incident cost, and that is called our single loss expectancy, or SLE. You'll need to know the calculation for that. SLE, single loss expectancy, is nothing more than the asset value times how much of that asset we lose every time it happens. That is our exposure factor. So asset value times exposure factor equals your per incident loss, or single loss expectancy. So every time it happens, I lose $10. Okay, so my single loss expectancy is $10. The asset value is $10 of loss. Again, if it's an utter loss, $10. What if I have a $10 asset, but every time the disruption happens, I only lose 10% of it? Oh, well, that means that your asset value being 10, the exposure factor being 10%, every loss expectancy is 1/10. That would be then $1 of the 10 is lost every time it happens. Okay, so I know how much I lose every time it happens, single loss expectancy. Can we annualize that? Well, sure we can. Just tell me how many times it happens in a year. It happens about 6 times in a year. Okay, well, 6 times the single loss expectancy gives me my annual loss expectancy. Your problem that you'll need to calculate on your exam may not be that easy. Why? Because they may say it doesn't happen 6 times per year. It happens once every 2 years. Oh, Alan, they're going to make me multiply by fractions. Yeah, they might. I hope you're there. If not, we've got bigger problems than the CISA exam. So, again, how is this calculated? Well, once I know the cost of the incident and the annual loss expectancy without a control, I can then compare that to the cost of the control and see if I want to buy it. So what is the annual loss expectancy without the safeguard? And how much would that be reduced if I had the safeguard? That'll give me, again, a value. And if I subtract the annual cost of the safeguard itself, I'm hoping that that number that results is still positive, meaning I saved more than what the safeguard cost me. That's what we're hoping for. Moving on from AIL calculations, we have data backup implementation issues. Ensuring periodic backups of transactional logs is a good consideration for backup of online systems. I think that's pretty obvious. One moment. Okay. Very good. Keeping us on track. Very good. So, database integrity, folks, this is not new information. This is just simply here, again, for your reference or the exam questions. We've already talked about it. Same goes for vital recovery materials and backup. Shorter requirements, shorter downtime requirements equate to higher, more frequent backup costs. I think that's obvious. Data backup alternatives that you need to be aware of. This is just a hodgepodge of various concepts. They talk about electronic vaulting versus remote journaling. Electronic vaulting is where we have an entire copy of information that is immediately sent electronically to a foreign remote site, maybe not foreign as in foreign country, but just external. Remote journaling is, well, for example, with our online e-commerce, not only do we have data backup happening quite a bit, but also, while we don't have parallel processing with our e-commerce, if someone purchases something on our e-store, it not only sends them a copy of the receipt with the invoice, but it sends us a copy of the receipt. But Alan, shouldn't you already have that information? Yes, we should, but here's the cool thing. If all of that stops and disappears, if the server disappears entirely, big hole in the earth, we still at least have the same receipt that the customer has, and we could rebuild the transactions if we had to. That's essentially remote journaling, where you have not the transaction itself, but evidence of the transaction that you could rebuild the transaction history from. Remote journaling. Automatic data backup. Again, shadow file processing is just simultaneous concurrent processing, so you don't have any downtime loss. Well, that's wonderful. Yeah, if you want to pay for it, it's all at a cost. I remember once upon a time when I first got into IT, a gentleman said, there is nothing in IT that more RAM or money can't fix. And it seemed kind of clever at the time. Data backup alternatives. Again, we have manual data backups. We have physical vaulting. This is where we're actually keeping hardware, basically disk backups or potentially tape backups, often the old days, in an off-site physical location. Today, this has changed somewhat with cloud computing. Now we already have the inherent resilience and fault tolerance of spreading the resources amongst different servers in different locations. So, and if any one goes down, you didn't lose the entirety of it. So again, this is a whole different way of looking at things now with cloud computing. However, the CISA exam is not there yet. It will be in the future probably, but not today. Again, I've already talked about electronic vaulting. This is just, again, exam preparation for you. You may be asked about network attached storage. If you're in IT, you may remember your file storage, your data racks, if you will, racks and racks and racks of servers. Again, oftentimes, unless you have privacy issues at hand and compliance requirements at hand, oftentimes we don't maintain this on site anymore. We actually virtualize it in the cloud. But nonetheless, you now know what network attached storage is. Hardware recovery alternatives. Again, it goes back to anything that has power is potentially going to lose power and therefore potential disruption. Anything we say in IT, anything with moving parts needs to have redundancy and fault tolerance. We've already talked about these exam preparation type questions before. It's a bit redundant here. Hardware recovery alternatives know the difference between a warm site, a cold site, and a hot site. These are off-site recovery locations. A cold site is, it's the cheapest, but all you've got basically is a facility to go to. Nothing is there. Nothing is configured. You don't even have heating, ventilation, air conditioning. It's basically a warehouse. Warm site is a little better than that. That's an off-site location that does have electricity, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, has some hardware, and it may have, but you may not have the software yet configured on it. As opposed to hot sites, that's where it's fully ready to go in parallel processing. The most expensive, but also the quickest recovery time. Depends on what your process needs. So again, we also have hardware recovery alternatives, mobile recovery sites we can talk about. When it comes to off-site recovery, where we might operate off-site from our primary location, recognize that security needs to be as tight at the alternative location as it is at the primary location. The data did not become less sensitive just because you're using it at a different location. Therefore, the off-site information processing facility must be as secured and controlled as the primary site. We have reciprocal agreements. That's nothing more than, hey, I'm a huge organization. I've got lots of offices that do basically the same thing. So if one site goes down, we'll divert the business and the processes and the requirements to the other site, and vice versa. Reciprocal agreements. Again, when we talk about hardware redundancy, we may even be talking about down at the hardware drive level. We may be talking about RAID configurations, network attached storage area networks. When it comes to RAID configurations, there are 5 levels of RAID. There's actually more than that now, but 5 levels of RAID that we typically talk about: RAID 0, RAID 1, RAID 3, and RAID 5. Again, what happened to RAID 2? What happened to RAID 4? That's really going back not to having network, or rather fault tolerance of data, but rather just fault tolerance of hardware. But at any rate, going on, RAID 1 mirroring, that's going to be what you're going to be asked about. That's essentially where you have 2 drives. One is mirrored to the other. You may have simultaneous writes to both drives at the same time. One is a mirror of the other. ISACA is going to be asking you potentially about RAID, and that's going to be your answer. They're going to be asking you about RAID 1, mirroring. You'll use mirroring when? If the recovery time objective is short or low, and the recovery point objective, meaning that you don't want to lose much data, is high. Vital material checklist, make sure you have a backup of your software and your compiled object programs. This is a very, very fancy way of saying backup of your applications. Not only do you need your data, but you need to have backup of the applications that run the data and process the data. One of the most common things you have to be concerned about is you've created backups here at your primary site, and you want to restore them in a recovery at your recovery site. But what you forgot is the version that you used to create the backup is new, and the version of the backup software at the old site is old, and the old version won't restore the new version. Should have made a backup of the current version of your backup software at the primary site so it can be used to restore current version backups at the recovery site. There's an example of backing up your compiled object programs. Network recovery alternatives, making sure we have fault tolerance in our communications in our network. We have alternative routing, diverse routing, long-haul network diversity. Even if you're not a network specialist, you can learn and memorize terms and definitions, and you'll be just fine. Other BCP issues and solutions. It could be potential just-in-time quick resupply. We talk about offsite storage and so forth. We already talked about never trust your business continuity disaster recovery if you haven't tested it. ISACA and CISSP both with ISC squared test you on this, but they have different names for their testing. Rather than 5 levels of testing of BCP like CISSP has, ISACA tests you about 3 levels. The paper test versus the preparedness test versus what they call the full operational test. You will need to know the difference in this. Again, a paper test is very theoretical. Let's just look at it on paper and see if it makes sense conceptually. Preparedness test is where we might actually use some resources to test that theory, but we're certainly not going to take any primary resources offline. In other words, we'll test restoration of a backup, but not on the live system, mind you. And then finally, full operational test, or what we also call full interruption testing. That is where we are actually testing on the live systems itself. Now then, not only do you need to know the differences between those levels of testing, you need to understand, never do a full operational test if you haven't even done a paper test first. So in your early testing, you'll do something that's less disruptive or potentially disruptive, which is your paper testing, as opposed to if everything is testing well through paper and preparedness, now maybe we're ready to go ahead and see if we could do this in a live real-time environment, see what might come about from that. Again, BCP Post-Test Monitoring, making sure that you compare the timing of your events planned versus as tested and so forth. Again, typical computer-related incidents. This is just listed for your general FYI. We can have incidents related to security issues, misuse of resources, loss of integrity from malicious code, viruses, and the like. Effective incident response requires teamwork. Believe it or not, ISACA feels that an incident response specialist capability for working well under pressure is actually more important than their own subject matter expertise to begin with. That's their feeling, and that's their question, and that's their exam, so that's the way you answer. Incident response stages, again, you've got essentially 6 stages. They won't be testing you necessarily on in depth on this, but you need to know, what do you do in your preparation? A well-defined, well-management incident response capability gives us the proactive procedures, not reactive, because preparation is proactive. Incident response is reactive. So if they're asking you about where does incident response begin, it begins before the incident happens, in the preparation itself. That's practicing risk management so you have less incident response management later. Again, we prepare to have an incident. We identify the incident. We contain the incident. We eradicate the incident, recover from the incident. Ladies and gentlemen, on Thursday and Friday, I'm going to be teaching that NIST Cybersecurity Framework Lead Implementer class. that says we have 5 functions to cybersecurity. Watch how they map. We have identify assets at risk and your processes that you need to protect with cybersecurity. Then they say you identify what you need to protect, you protect those assets, identify, protect, then you need to be able to, here it comes, detect when an incident occurs. That's number 2. You need to be able to respond to that detected incident. That is containment. And you need to recover from that incident. Identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. Those 5 core functions are represented right here. Of course, NIST CSF wasn't around. Well, actually it was. It originally came about in 2013, but I'm not sure even that ISACA was even aware of it at the time. The initial executive order was issued in 2013 by President Obama. We have to secure our critical infrastructure. We better get a plan. And that's where NIST CSF was born. But that's a different class. Sign up. It starts on Thursday. So identifying network devices. One of the first steps, again, in preparing for incident response is knowing what is it you need to protect and what is it you're going to need to respond to. Again, identifying what network devices exist and how they could go down and how they could be compromised, and then figuring out how we respond. Again, we also prepare in the planning in the stage 1 for, well, if you want to audit logs later, you better turn on logging now. That's part of your preparation. We need to make sure that our logging, if it's going to be logging events on different machines, that the different machines are recording the exact same time. They need to be synchronized. Otherwise, you can't rebuild events. We recognize the signs of an incident. That's incident identification. Identify, protect, detect. Detecting an incident. Recognizing the signs of an incident. Again, you must do that before you can potentially respond. So again, I talked about this yesterday. When it comes to incident response, the first thing is, if you suspect an incident has occurred, your initial response should not be to try to fix it. Your first response should be to verify the existence of the incident. In other words, we think we've detected an incident. Does it qualify as an incident as we've defined one? So we have to verify, validate an incident before we can potentially respond to it. That's always your first step. So recognizing the signs of an incident, again, is going back to initial detection. They, again, have various technical means and concerns that go to this topic on your exam preparation that you'll just memorize, for detecting through technical intrusion detection. Implementing honeypots with decoy files. Those are basically fake systems that are designed to emulate a real system on your network. So if you do have somebody that comes through your firewall and is poking around to try to find things to attack, you're giving them soft spots to attack that are not real resources. Those are honeypots. Again, we've already talked about imaging hard drives before for backup purposes, but for incident response, we image hard drives because you should never be investigating the compromised hardware directly itself, because the process of your investigation is inadvertently modifying the hardware you're looking at. Simply opening a file on a hardware, on a hard drive, even if you didn't change what you thought the data content was, opening the file changed the metadata that's stored with the file, the last open date. And guess what happens in a court of law? Who was the last person to modify this file? You were. I didn't change anything in the file. Yeah, you did. You opened it. That's the last open date. That's metadata that changed. You were the last person to modify that file. Oh. Well, heck, how can I investigate? Don't open the files. Image the drive first. Work off of the image, leaving the original preserved untouched. You're essentially creating a view of that drive to investigate, aren't you? Just like ACL software does. So imaging hard drives, this is what they're talking about here with the byte-for-byte copies. That's for preserving your forensic evidence. Again, more examine things you need to memorize for preserving that evidence. Chain of custody requires that the evidence is accounted for at all times, that you document and track who has it, where, and what it was used for. Again, assessment containment actions, assessing current system status needs to be the first response against after suffering denial of service attack. This is just general stuff you'll be memorizing for your test. Again, responding to hacker incidents. One of the very first things you want to do is try to prevent hacker incidents by perhaps restricting hardware usage. And by that, you're hardening the systems to not do as much. Therefore, they can't be compromised as easily. Responding to hacker incidents, again, whether it's this exam or your CISM exam or your C-Risk exam, ISACA does love asking you about potential SQL injection attacks. And all that is again, where let's go ahead and say that you have a form online for people to fill in to request support or something of this nature. Well, as soon as you have a form online, that means that they're going to be able to input information into your system and you don't know who they are. Well, the problem is you told them, enter your first name here, but instead of entering your first name, they entered an SQL command. Well, yeah, but our system shouldn't interpret that information as a command. It should know that that's just supposed to be a name. This was the problem that we had, is that systems would accept information, and if it looked like a command, it might run the command. And that's where we would inject code or inject an execution into an SQL process through an unchecked form. That means that form needs to be scrubbed before it actually allows the input to get to the system to make sure that nothing bad is coming through. This is why sometimes when you go to post something on a forum and it doesn't allow you to post a website URL address, because it could be that there's something malicious at that URL and they don't want that to come through. Things like this. So again, active hacker sessions, ISACA has ideas on what you should do for countermeasures. Mostly they want you to isolate the system from the other systems. And again, that's what you're seeing here with LAN segmentation and the like. Again, shutdown procedures when preserving evidence. ISACA feels the very first thing that you want to do with a potentially attacked system is to disconnect from all power sources, which if you actually are in incident response, you know that you can lose a lot of valuable information because, well, a lot of the information was in RAM, and when you shut down the system, you lose the RAM potentially. Responding to malicious code, again, we already understand what malicious code is. Viruses, worms, Trojan horses. You'll need to know the difference between the three. A virus needs a carrier, it needs an email, it needs something to bring it, and it needs to be opened or used in order to enact it, as opposed to a worm. It's self-propagating. It doesn't need that carrier. It can do it on its own. So again, responding to malicious code, ISACA wants to make sure you understand how important antivirus is and keeping it up to date. Eradicating, they point out that be careful when you try to restore a backup, because it could be that the virus that just caused your problem was already on a backup from a previous backup. So restoring the backup might restore the problem as well. So making sure that you understand that. Again, understanding disclosure and recovery for potential prosecution with your evidence. Regular discovery is the process of plaintiff and defense requesting, providing information as it relates to pending litigation. Electronic discovery is what it sounds like. Discovery of, well, electronic information in electronic format. Analyzing, determining potential compromises and issues from the incident. You start to assess your damage immediately following recovery. And then finally, post-incident monitoring. This is just making sure that you are back to all systems normal. And also, we need to recognize that we might need to prepare for incident response by having a basic incident response computer forensics toolkit, so that way we can investigate data that is existing in places that, well, we don't normally look. So for example, instead of being on the normal space that is enumerated in Windows Explorer on a Windows machine, for example, when you go to Windows Explorer and you see files, turns out if you go to your computer configuration and you realize that there's been a whole chunk of your drive that's been sequestered and reserved for, well, artificial memory, we call it, right? Rather than having volatile RAM, we can actually go ahead and set up in our Slack space a type of, well, non-volatile RAM that is on hard drive that's just basically expand our RAM capabilities. even though that's what you're supposed to be using that for, turns out it is hard drive space. And if you had a utility that could write to it outside of the operating system, why, you could put information there that nobody else would find. Interesting. So we need to have special tools to see that kind of thing. Okay, so we are now at 1:20. We are, let me check my timing. One moment. I think we're doing pretty well, but I always like to check. Doing quite well. Very good. So let's go ahead and do a few practice questions, and then we will take a 15-minute break. How does that sound? Okay, so of the following, which can be used to check compliance with a service level agreement's requirement for uptime? What is the best answer? Do you remember? Wow, we only had a few people answer. It's not so hard. Do you remember? We actually talked about it in the presentation. Okay, so we've got about half the audience has answered. And 70% of you remember, according to ISACA. And again, see, this goes to show how difficult these exams can be if you weren't prepared by somebody who knows what's going to be on the test. Because here's the problem. You could actually use, well, console logs and systems logs, exception reports, which is a type of problem log. All of these could be used. However, RTFQ, look at what it's actually asking for. It's not just asking about general information, it's asking about uptime requirements. And the best answer for uptime requirements would be availability reports, which is where our uptime is documented because it shows how much of our time was down.